Ben. I've been with Ambition for coming up to 10 years now. I've been doing the sort of legal BD marketing recruitment for 13 years, the last sort of 3 in the US market. So we're obviously doing our half year webinar today. So just to give you sort of an overview, we're going to just run through some key themes, stuff that we've seen, both sort of market related, role related, that hopefully you guys will find quite interesting. Obviously, Sean, who's been part of our team for the last 2 years or so, is going to jump in and talk about certain themes as well. Big picture overview for us, the market, as it always really has been in legal BD, to be honest with you, is very candidate led. We have seen, I guess, sort of a bit of change this year in terms of a real prioritization from clients to want people coming from specific sort of practice and sector backgrounds, and maybe being a little bit less flexible with that comparative to perhaps we saw in 2025. And that's led into a number of interesting observations that we could talk about a little bit further as we go through the presentation. I do think overall there's quite a few sort of interesting trends that we could do, but it hasn't changed overnight since we did our last one in December. But anyway, we'll move on to the first sort of observation and sort of first point that we're going to cover here, and I'll chuck you over to Sean to discuss bits and pieces around some of that sort of practice areas and sector groups that we've seen particularly high volume in.
All right, so getting into exactly that. Obviously, we know that there's been a couple different approaches for various firms as far as their activity from a hiring front so far this year. From our perspective, we've really noticed that there's been a really distinct concentration of practice areas that are really of high volume for us, that we've seen a lot of openings for, that we've been ourselves sourcing on. We've seen some that are in that kind of continued demand section. And then we are slowly starting to see an uptick in specialist roles as well. So to kind of get into the nitty gritty here, the highest volume of positions we've seen, I mean, kind of rightfully so, are the corporate and transactional practices. So that one side of the house for most all law firms are particularly active. We've seen a lot of private equity funds and private capital positions. Does seem like many of the same categories of firms are after the similar types of talent. I know we'll get into that more later on in this webinar, but those particular areas are the ones that we've seen a lot of activity in, and we project we'll probably see more activity in going forward into the rest of the year. Continued demand. I think although we've seen a lot of activity on the corporate transactional side, we have also seen kind of a steady approach on the litigation, disputes, and regulatory side of the house. We've been ourselves working on many of those positions across the manager and senior manager levels. We expect that that'll continue into the second half of the year, as well as firms that are really starting to beef up their litigation, regulatory, and disputes practices are going to really start to be active and become active, especially in kind of the late stages of Q3, beginning of Q4. And then lastly, the specialist positions. We have actually seen a rise in the, especially client relationship positions, but also comms, events, and digital marketing roles. I think within the communications bucket, what we've noticed is there's been a bit of a specialization there, whether it be PR, internal comms, etc. I think there is a delineation of what types of focuses certain firms are going after when they set up those departments, and we're seeing a couple of those roles across both verticals within that comms description. But I think client relationship is certainly the role right now, or client sector roles, however they're described internally, are the ones that have seen and will continue to see the most growth in. So that's kind of just a little flavor of what we've seen so far, and I'll kick back over to Ben to go through the next section here.
Thank you very much. So yes, obviously one of the points I mentioned just in the intro, I think that's been quite interesting to sort of observe, really. I wouldn't say a whole scale change from last year, but I think firms are really prioritizing in those BD practice and sector roles real industry knowledge and practice knowledge. So I think that has tended to always be the case at the more senior levels. So a lot of the sort of AD director roles that I've worked on, it's kind of almost a bit of a given that they've got to have that. But we have started to see that filter through this year quite prominently, even in sort of that managerial space, which is creating a few sort of interesting problems for clients, because I think law firms have always taken the opinion of wanting to hire from other law firms And then when you extrapolate that even further to a particular practice or sector group, it's obviously narrowing their talent pool further and further and further. So that's been quite interesting to see. And I think firms appear to be more willing to try and hold out for that expertise. I'm not convinced it's necessarily the right approach for every role, because I think, if you're a high caliber BD person, you should be able to learn another practice or sector as long as you have some form of interest in it. But that is definitely something that we've seen quite prominently this year. So it's creating just a level of even more competitiveness for certain roles. I did a little bit of analysis just on our market this year, and the thing that I think really sort of highlights this as well is that most firms from first interview stage to offer stage, that period has dropped to 22 days so far this year. So from the first interview to offer, firms are completing that entire process within 22 days. And there's going to be some variance on the levels, and some might go longer than that. Some more junior roles might go a little bit shorter than that. But that's in the region of a 45% shortening than last year. So what that has sort of really indicated to us is that you guys who have a real true expertise in a practice or sector, you are really valuable in this market. And I think you can expect, there to be high demand in your skill set. Also from a candidate point of view, you need to be prepared that, because firms have taken this approach, their processes are going to move, pretty quickly. So you kind of need to keep that in mind when you're entering processes or when you're evaluating the market. So, I think firms are taking a little bit longer to hold out for the right person, but once they've got the person in process, they are moving quickly. I guess areas which maybe are slightly sort of buck the trend on this has been basically all the roles outside of practice bit and sector BD roles. So anything that's client relationship, anything that's comms, anything that's events, we've had a number of people either even come from out of sector, particularly when it's on the comms, the brand side of things, or they're not demanding so much of a specialized industry knowledge for those positions. So those areas have sort of bucked the trend, but for these BD practice roles, there's been a real desire from firms to hone in on this practice and industry experience, and it's also led to clients potentially considering people at different levels as well. So they may have a BDM in private equity, but they could flex it to senior manager if that person has private equity. So firms do seem to have gone in that direction from what we've seen this year, even outside of the traditional more senior roles where it was always, a bit of a prerequisite really. So that's been something quite interesting and, something that we've had to sort of adapt to as the year's gone on really.
Nice. Thank you very much for that. So now we'll move into the next section here, which we've noticed step up moves have really dominated most all of the activity that we've seen across the legal BD space so far. It's been a pretty distinct trend. Most all candidates are moving for promotions or the next level above where they are at previously. I think this makes a lot of sense, especially for what Ben just touched on when you talk about the process shortening for those that have that specialist experience. Those types of individuals are usually coming with multiple processes that they're considering, right? So multiple opportunities that they are going to potentially make a move onto, which in turn, kind of creates that, inter-competitiveness or battle between a, subset of firms that, ultimately will have to kind of woo or sway that candidate to try and get them to accept an offer. So in most cases, what we've seen is that, the most logical move for a firm is to offer that promotion. I think it's not something quite like we saw back in 2021 where, those were being offered kind of almost willy-nilly, but, it's a case now where, where it makes sense, especially for those that demonstrate that, understanding, can provide that utility to partners. Those are the types of moves that we've seen a lot of candidates make. I think from the hiring side of things, lateral moves are a lot harder to hire for a lot of the same reasons why candidates are looking for promotions. To sell them a lateral move, not necessarily the biggest selling point for a lot of people. Now, I will say there is a lot of instances where firms can offer lateral opportunities that have pathways forward, so pathways for advancement, development, whatever that may be. Those are the types of moves that you will see people make laterals for. However, they are just fewer and far between. I think, as said, clear justification is needed for making a move, especially within the legal space. It is very difficult to differentiate a firm to a firm. There's very, very subtle intricacies that, can ultimately sway a candidate one way or another. So being very clear in terms of what the offering looks like to a candidate and for a candidate to evaluate in making a move is equally as important. I think another point that we've noticed as well is in the wake of COVID, we've seen that a lot of candidates aren't just looking for the highest salary as well. So the holistic opportunity really needs to make sense for someone to make a move on, and it doesn't need to be just, the highest title, highest salary, etc. So that's a little bit of what we've noticed in terms of some of the movement that's gone on over the course of the first half of the year.
Right then, global roles. So before everyone goes back and tells all their colleagues that there's loads of global roles in the US, that's not my point here. But what my observation, and this is based on what we've seen in the first 6 months, is a lot of our sort of large global clients have positioned quite a few sort of leadership roles in the US, which I guess for us has been an uptick this year. As many of you know, obviously I spent 10 years in London before moving here. So it's been really quite interesting to see some of those firms take roles that, are managing global teams and positioning them intentionally in the US, or adding the US as a secondary sort of location to where people managing EMEA-based teams may have been in London before. So that's just something that we've seen a lot of, and we've taken on a number of sort of mandates this year where these people, particularly sort of AD director level, are based here in New York and are managing, teams not just across the US but across Europe as well. I think that from a candidate perspective, we tend to get quite a lot of interest in those types of roles, because I think, the US is such a big and dominant market. A lot of the roles here are centered on the US piece, and rightfully so. But that's just been an interesting trend that we've seen outside of sort of that AD director level leadership positions. We have also seen quite a few sort of senior manager and managerial roles where they are becoming sort of part of these central functions. So the firms that have got sort of an existing client relationship, team, for example, tend to operate in a bit more of a global capacity. So, you're going to have a senior client relationship managing 3 banking clients, and they'll have a counterpart who's based in London, and they'll work very closely from that respect as well. So I do think this is not necessarily so much an industry shift. I'm not saying all the big US firms are suddenly putting loads of global roles in New York, but from our client base and what we've observed, it's definitely been an uptick this year, and something that I think generally people quite enjoy getting involved with, and it's also another skill set for people to learn in a different type of environment. So that's been quite interesting to see this year, really. So just wanted to comment on that from a purely more of an ambition standpoint than it being sort of an industry objective.
Right. And here we are, the dedicated AI slide. You guys were all waiting for it. So here it is. To be quite honest with you all, we haven't quite seen the surge that we were expecting. I know coming into the year, we had back in December when we had done our kind of end of 2025, heading into 2026 forecast, we had talked a little bit about the early discussions that many firms were having about the use of AI, what it could mean, roles dedicated to AI, etc. And we had talked a little bit about preparation for, both candidates and clients alike for that kind of dawn of time to come. Whereas it didn't quite yield the result we were, I guess, not necessarily looking for, but what we were expecting. We're finding that in our conversations with clients from varying firms, whether small, large, etc., AI is definitely a part of the conversation. We're noticing that it's not quite embedded into day-to-day practice or a cadence just yet. It's kind of on its way to getting to that point. We've noticed that, some of the larger firms have started to invest heavy amounts of capital into their own infrastructure for these sort of things. So it'll be very interesting to see, where this all goes. I think we still are a little too early to call exactly what it will all look like going forward. But I think what we can assert is that we haven't seen the boom that we were expecting. We don't have very many roles that are focused within the AI sphere just yet. I think the expectation is in the future that probably would be the case, but we have no indication just yet based on what we've seen that is happening now. And then furthermore, I think the final point is that the embedding nature of the AI technology into day-to-day approach for most all firms is also coming, but it's not quite there yet. I think there is still a little bit of deciphering that needs to be done in terms of, senior leaders figuring out how and where to deploy these sort of mechanisms to help in the best way possible. I think the bottom line is that it will be coming, it will help, it won't take over. So at least that's what we've noticed so far. Again, it is a bit of a moving target. So we will try our best to kind of keep you informed of what we're noticing, but at least to this point in the year, that's what we've kind of seen.
Right, this is a slide I feel like I've done for the last 5 years, but it's still a question we get asked by near enough everyone we speak to around in-office policy. I think 75-80% of our roles this year are requesting 4 days in office now. So I think I can't see that coming back, to be honest with you. So whilst firms typically sort of have a blanket firm-wide policy of 4 days, yeah, obviously I can't comment on how readily that's enforced at XYZ firm. But what I can tell you is that most of our clients, or a large majority of our clients, are now putting this into the expectation from BD and marketing staff. Again, probably a trend this year. We have seen fewer and fewer pushback from people on this, whether that's because it's just resigned to that's the way the market's going, as opposed to it not being important any longer. I would hazard a guess that's what's going on. But I think the reality is I think it is going to stay at that level. Can make loads of different cases as to why firms are doing it. But what we've observed this year is that's what typically most firms are doing. I do think there are some regional differences. We probably get far less pushback in New York than we do in DC or the West Coast, for example. And again, I expect that to continue. And as more and more go to 4, it really does shut down sort of the avenue to get greater flexibility. So one thing that I would say is, I know this is always a very personal topic and it's very individual to every one of you. If this is something that is really important and you are in a firm that does offer greater flexibility than 4, then I think the reality is your options are going to be a bit more limited if that's what you're looking for. However, on the flip side, if you are a firm, if you are a hiring manager, this does also give you opportunities if your firm is more flexible. It is going to allow you to offer something different in the market to maybe appeal to a demographic of the audience that finds it tough to do 4 days in, whatever that reason might be. So I think there's opportunities out there for the firms that do have more flexibility, but it is narrowing and we are definitely seeing the 4 days come through. I do think law firms are trying to do this in a grown-up environment. I still know lots of firms who are doing 4 days who are quite flexible around, if people need to leave early or start a bit later, there is that degree of flexibility. And we're seeing a few things like firms being remote for the last 2 weeks of August and last 2 weeks of December. So they are trying to sort of trade this off a little bit, but sort of the general consensus that we're getting from clients is that the sort of traditional sort of 4-day mandate, I should say, is what they're really sort of favoring, to be honest.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we'll see a lot more of as we go forward, that's for sure. And as we move forward into the conversation, something that if any one of you that's listening here has spoken with me, you've probably heard this come out of my mouth a whole lot, and that's timing is sometimes means everything and certainly matters. We are into the second half of the year, scarily enough, but that does give everyone out there time to kind of forecast what to do, how to plan, and what to expect over the course of the next 6 months. I think whether you are a prospective job hunter or if you're going to be hiring for your teams, what we'll probably notice is that, like last year and in years past, firms will stay active and interviews will keep moving over the course of July. I think we will notice, especially over the next few weeks, firms will, make it a point to try and get people in front of their hiring managers. As most everyone in our field knows that once August rolls around, you do tend to find a bit of a lull. People are on vacations, take advantage of the month before kids go back to school, etc. So it is naturally slower. We will expect the same to be the case this year. While we will try our best to keep things moving, I think the natural expectation is that it does take 2 individuals to kind of make this all work. So naturally, we will try our best to keep it going, but we're up against, people that are out of the office. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. Once we get to post Labor Day / middle of September, that's where we really start to see the final stretch or ramp of the year. Firms will really start to kind of be aggressive with their hiring over the course of that time. They'll really start to identify key hires that they will like to try and make before the end of the year is here. Obviously, they aren't working with the full breadth of their budget any longer, so it will be more of those really key hires that firms need to try and make sure that those are sorted before we flip the calendar year to 2027. So for all of you out there that, maybe prospectively job hunting over the course of the next 6 months, or if you're going to be hiring for your teams, this is generally what you can expect as far as the schedule of events or the nature of kind of what the next couple months will look like for each respective approach.
Right. Just a quick sort of summary. As we pointed out at the beginning, the market's been good this year. Job flow's been steady. We have really noticed sort of that selective demand by particular clients for roles, which I think has tightened up a bit more since 2025. I think there's a number of reasons, obviously, as we've kind of touched upon sort of through the presentation, part of it led by BD, part of it led by partners. But I think that's going to be something that we continue to see for the remainder of the year. And obviously that leads into some of these secondary points, right? So if law firms are having an ever more selective mindset with who they want, it creates an ever more increasingly competitive market. And it just means that people are just in really high demand. But on the flip side of that, if they're really selective, jobs can stay on the market for a bit longer. So that's kind of sort of what we're seeing. I don't see really much shift from clients changing their stance on those BD roles. Obviously, those specialist positions which are more open, whether it's events, comms, that whole piece, because of the nature of the size of the teams, they are much smaller. So the frequency of those hitting the market is less than your traditional BD roles. So I think a lot of that's all going to stay the same. I think the step up moves and people wanting to take that next career ladder, ultimately people in BD, they can be quite title driven. They do want to see sort of that progress, and rightly so. So I think if you're a hiring manager and you want to hire somebody from a lateral move, you've really got to go over and above just selling the firm and the role, right? You've got to sell the tangibles, you've got to sell the culture, you've got to sell the team, you've got to sell the future career progression. And also, if you're a candidate, make sure that you're also evaluating things correctly, right? Sometimes a lateral move can be really worthwhile. You could take a lateral move, work with a really great superior that's going to help develop your skills, and there's a clear pathway for you to take that move 6-12 months down the line, rather than putting yourself in a position just for the sake of a title and a compensation raise, really. So I still think, naturally, people are drawn to a role that has a bigger title than they currently have, and that's completely fine. And I think that continues to happen. But yeah, I wouldn't dismiss sort of lateral moves if I was job seeking and maybe wasn't quite at the level to take that next step up. But these are some of the key takeaways. I know there may be some additional, if people want to speak to either me or Sean or anyone else in our team outside this discussion, do let us know. Or if there's certain points in this commentary that didn't quite make sense or you want us to elaborate more on them, then please do drop us a message. We'll just flip this over to the Q&A part of things. I had quite an interesting question from somebody around, with all the mergers that are happening within law firms, if you're sitting in one of those firms, how do you identify whether you should stay put or whether you should move, which I thought was quite interesting from my perspective. I think with these mergers, it quite often does take a few years for them to really integrate well and integrate the functions really well. So I think it's quite a hard one to understand. I think it also depends which firm you sit in that's merging. There's quite often one that is the more dominant one in a merger. So I think, not every role is affected in the same manner. I know lots of people have been in mergers, gone through mergers and come out with a much better role than they had pre-merger, or one that excites them more than they did pre-merger. But on the flip side of that, there are changes, and change isn't always good for everyone. So I think you kind of got to try and value that on an individual basis. Try and look at how specifically, if you are in one of those practice BD roles, how is that merger going to affect what you're doing now, and does that positively or negatively influence your chances? Are there multiple other BD people from the other side of the firm that are doing what you're doing? How does that affect your progression progress? There's lots of different things, but I'd say most of the time you've probably got to give it at least a good sort of 3 to 6 months to try and get a bit of an idea of where this might be heading before you sort of jump ship, unless you've got a real clear idea that this role isn't going to be here in 6 months. Then obviously I'd encourage you to act on that. But that's would typically be my advice, but it is very individual to each firm, each role, and your own individual circumstance as well. But yeah, enjoyed that question.
Yeah, that was a good one. That was a very good one. We do have one more, and I thought it was a good one. It kind of touched on a few points that we had kind of covered throughout the webinar itself, but it was, when does specialization become key? Which I think right now we've talked a little bit about, how we've seen a lot more success for those candidates that are of that kind of specialized skill set. Maybe they have certain, industry understanding, or whether it be practice area experience. I think what most people can notice is, once you start to have more exposure to partners themselves, naturally they're going to want someone who has that high level industry knowledge, that depth of experience within a certain practice area, to leverage past experiences, whether it be good, bad, or indifferent, to angle people in certain directions, or point people in opposite directions to avoid potholes and what have you. So I think ultimately, when you start getting towards that manager level, I think where you really start to establish more of a rapport with the partners you support, you can demonstrate some of that industry expertise and knowledge there as well. It's a bit harder to do it when you're in a more junior phase of your career, because obviously, you are more executional in the nature of what you're trying to do. You're doing a lot of the RFP submissions and chambers submissions and stuff of that sort. Whereas once you start to make that move into the manager, senior manager end of things, you do start to have more of a quote unquote seat at the table with, the partners and senior leaders within the practice you support. So I think, all things said, it does kind of have an individualistic type of approach. It does depend on where or what structure your team has, what involvement you have with your partners and senior leaders. But I think nonetheless, once you start to get to that end of things where you start to be involved in those conversations, naturally that should kind of signify to folks that, it should be maybe a good time to have a thought of, is this a practice area or a vertical that I'd like to continue supporting? Or is it, a case where I'd like to kind of be focused on other areas? But really good question. I think it's one that we'll continue to see more of as we go on to this year and beyond. But yeah, really appreciate that one as well. At this point, everybody, we are all wrapped up, so we'll leave you to it. As mentioned, we will always be available to answer any specific questions or thoughts you may have. Feel free to drop Ben or I a note via email or LinkedIn.
Thanks very much, everyone.